Hello everyone, my name is Kirchner and this is the first video in a series of short videos which will accompany the course ASPB1105, Human Rights and Human Security in the Arctic. We are going to have a few shorter videos this time around to basically give you the information that would also be or will also be available through the actual lectures, which will be from the 17th until the 19th of November of this year, 2020. Due to the pandemic, the lectures will only be online through Adobe Connect. But I know that a lot of the students might be in different locations. Many of you might not even be in Finland at this time. And internet connectivity might not be the same everywhere. And in order to have a backup plan in case there should be technical difficulties during the live lectures, I'm going to make a few short videos to give you the same content basically. So if you miss anything during the lectures next week, here you're going to get the core information, the basic information that you are going to need. Also, all the information is already in Moodle. You have seen the slides already and the accompanying materials, which I'm asking you to read. And this is basically what you need for this course. As you will already have seen, there's not going to be a regular exam, but rather an essay exam. For the whole course, which consists of my 3 lectures as well as lectures by 3 other colleagues, for the whole course ASPB 1105, you have to write 1 essay exam. You're going to have a choice between 4 essay topics. The essay topics will be handed out on the 10th of December, which is the last day of the course. Your deadline is going to be the 11th of January, and we're planning to have all the results, the grades ready by the beginning of February, so ideally after 3 weeks, 1st of February. Hoping that nothing gets in the way, of course, with the pandemic, but that's basically the plan for now. Now, when we're talking about human rights and human security in the Arctic, we're looking at a number of very diverse challenges. Some of you will already have participated in the lecture in early September, which was about the Arctic as our home. In that lecture, I talked a bit about how the Arctic is home for very different communities, of course for the indigenous communities in the Arctic, but also for relative newcomers like myself. Those who have already attended the lecture in September, you'll maybe see a bit of an overlap now at the beginning, but bear with me for a few minutes because a lot of the issues are relevant for the September lecture and now our upcoming lectures on the 17th to 19th. I'm going to use a handful of books, not even a handful, which I also recommend to you. And most importantly, the book Arctic Governance in a Changing World by Durfee and Johnstone, the Law of the Sea textbook by Professor Tanaka, The International Law of the Sea, and 2 indigenous rights textbooks, one by Asata Xantaki, Indigenous Rights and United Nations Standards, and one by Anaya, Indigenous Peoples in International Law. In addition, I strongly recommend the books by Klaus Dodds and Mark Nuttall called The Scramble for the Poles and The Arctic, What Everyone Needs to Know. What Everyone Needs to Know is actually a really nice series from Oxford University Press. They also have books on Antarctica, climate change, and so on as basic introductions. So that's something you might want to have a look at. But I'm sure that if you've already taken a couple of courses now in the last 2 months within the Arctic Studies program, that this is information you probably already have by now. As always, feel free to drop me an email, get in touch if there are any questions. I realize that this is a difficult and challenging time for many participants, and everybody has different ways to learn. So some of you might be more auditory learners, some of you will learn better with the interaction within a group or simply by reading a book. That's why I try to put a lot of different materials in the Moodle, different ways to learn, but of course it's somewhat different from actually sitting together in a classroom and having a discussion. So as always, feel free to send me an email. I'll answer questions depending on the nature of the question, either directly or preferably in the Moodle, so that everybody gets the answer in case other students have the same questions. Now, what do we want to do in these 3 days? These 3 lectures, 3 times 90 minutes. At the end of these 3 days, I want you to have a basic understanding of human rights and human security in the Arctic as part of international Arctic law. I'm a lawyer myself. I'm working at the intersection of different fields of international law with regard to the Arctic, for example, climate change law, human rights, the law of the sea, environmental law. I realize a lot of the students come from very different backgrounds. That's why I will give you a bit of an introduction, which might be a bit more boring for the law students, as to how things work from an international legal perspective. But then I want to get back and try to connect this to the reality of life in the Arctic. After all, Arctic law, international law, it's meant to serve a purpose. It's meant to serve the people who actually live here, live in the Arctic, and it's aimed at protecting the Arctic not just as a region or not just the vulnerable environment, but also the people who depend on this environment, the people who live here. I want you to be able to find information to solve problems or at least raise awareness regarding issues concerning human rights and human security in the Arctic. And ideally also to be able to do a bit of your own research and realize that we're talking about a discipline which is not necessarily yours for a lot of students, and this is also a language which for most students is not their first language. In an ideal scenario, I want you to be able to discuss these issues, also relatively novel issues for you, in English. For that, we'll have the actual lectures next week. And I really urge you to make use of the possibility to interact. I know that these online lectures, they tend to be a bit more like classical lectures with the professor just talking to the students and the students just sitting there and listening, like you're doing right now when you're watching this video. Well, that's not the purpose of this course, of course. So by all means, feel free to ask questions, feel free to interrupt. All the materials are already online. If you don't get through all the materials in the 3 days next week, that's totally fine. You'll have the whole material, you can read up on it, you can always get back and ask questions. But ideally, I would hope that we have a lively discussion in the coming days, because discussions are important to learn from each other. We all have different perspectives, different expectations, different experiences. And discussions are also an important aspect of the ways in which human safety and human rights are safeguarded in the Arctic. The first issue I want to talk about are the actors in the Arctic. Who are the entities, the groups, the people who actually shape international Arctic law, who shape the rules which protect human safety and human rights in the Arctic? How do they act and how do they matter for international governance of the Arctic? First of all, we have the indigenous peoples, the people who have called the Arctic their home for thousands of years. They live in all Arctic states except for Iceland, where the local population is a settler population because Iceland was unsettled earlier. We have indigenous communities all over the rest of the Arctic, from the European Arctic, Sapmi, the homeland of the Sami people, across northern Russia, but also, of course, in Greenland, Canada, and Alaska. Often, it's not really clear who is indigenous. The definition as to who is indigenous is often left to the states. The indigenous peoples in the Arctic like indigenous peoples elsewhere, they've experienced colonization. They've experienced a long history of centuries of unfreedom, of not being able to make decisions for themselves, for their homeland. This is slowly changing, also thanks due to international law. And it's the indigenous peoples themselves who've played an important role and continue to play an important role in shaping international law in this regard. Often, nation states try to define who is indigenous and to create a specific legal status, not based on the will of the local communities, of the indigenous communities, but on the interests of the state. For example, in Russia, only around 40 small indigenous communities are recognized. And one of the conditions for recognition is that you have fewer than 50,000 members. In Sapmi, we have the problem that the legal definitions as to who is Sami are different in, say, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. The indigenous communities, nevertheless, have found ways as indigenous peoples, through their representatives, to play a role in the governance of the Arctic, and we'll see that in a moment. The key actor in the Arctic, the key actors, they're still the Arctic states. We have a range of different states in the Arctic in terms of political systems or development, but overall it can be said that we have relatively wealthy states, relatively developed states in the Arctic. The Arctic states, usually defined as Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the European mainland, Iceland, Russia, Canada, the US with regards to Alaska, and Denmark with regard to Greenland. So it's the geography which makes them Arctic. Large countries like Russia or the US, they have significant non-Arctic parts, but having a part of the country in the Arctic, at or near the Arctic Circle, for example, makes it country Arctic. This definition of the term Arctic is a political one. It has very little to do with the climate or the flora and fauna, for example. It is somewhat related to the geography, insofar as you need a certain vicinity to the Arctic Circle. Iceland, for example, only in the northernmost edge of Iceland, tiny island, is actually north of the Arctic Circle. While, for example, in the US, you have overwhelming large part of the US, of course, far from the Arctic. And that brings us to the next problem. Decision makers might often overlook the fact that they live in an Arctic country. In a place like Finland or Sweden or Norway, that's difficult to imagine. But even here, you can see that the national power centers, they're often far away from the Arctic regions. If you go to Helsinki or Stockholm, you're also, not just in terms of the climate or in terms of geography, in many ways, it feels much closer to, let's say, Central Europe, Western Europe, than it would feel to a remote village, let's say, in the European Arctic, in the European High North, or elsewhere in the Arctic. And this is also reflected in the geography. For example, between Helsinki and Nuorgam and Utsjoki, if you drive by car, you drive over 1,300 kilometers. From Ottawa to Iqaluit, it's over 2,000 kilometers. In the US and Russia, the distances are much farther. For example, between Utqiagvik and Washington, D.C., it's more than 5,500 kilometers. So you have these large geographical distances. And they often also translate into emotional, mental, and political distances. The Arctic has very different levels of importance for different Arctic states. For a country like Iceland or Finland, the Arctic is of crucial importance. To a certain degree, that can still be said for Russia, because the Arctic there is seen as an important source of material wealth. In addition to the Arctic states in the proper sense of the term, a large number of states recently have expressed an interest in the Arctic without being located in the Arctic. There are a significant number of countries which have sought and obtained observer status with the Arctic Council, for example. Just a few days ago was now announced that Estonia is going to seek this status. In fact, Estonia is the closest country to the Arctic so far. A lot of other countries are much more removed in geographical terms from the Arctic, but they have a significant history, for example, when it comes to Arctic research. Other states have economic interests in the Arctic. The key example here is China. China depends for its wealth on international trade, which in turn means depending on maritime connections on ships going from one place to another. The Arctic Ocean is becoming an important shipping route. Now that climate change leads to the disappearance of the sea ice, we see that this is becoming an attractive alternative because the route between, let's say, China and Western Europe going through the Arctic is much shorter and also safer, at least in terms of security, when it comes to issues such as armed conflicts, pirate attacks, and so on. It's much safer than the traditional route through the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal, or let alone around Africa. So the interest in the Arctic is growing. Often it's a commercial interest, but in some cases it's also scientific interest or merely curiosity. There's something like an Arctic moment right now, insofar as the international community is more and more aware that climate change is changing the Arctic forever. There's this idea of seeing the Arctic once more before it disappears. Well, the Arctic does not disappear, but this idea led to a boom in cruise tourism, for example, in the Arctic in the recent years. We'll have to see what happens to this now with regard to the pandemic, as obviously cruise ships are an inherently unsafe location to be in during such an outbreak. Now, the interest in the Arctic grows. Climate change, however, is just part of it. The other key aspect is globalization. Globalization and climate change together, they're the two driving forces for change in the Arctic. And both also are reflected in the way the Arctic is governed and in the way decisions are made for the Arctic and for the people who live in the Arctic. There are a number of international organizations in the wider sense of the term, which are relevant for the Arctic, for decision making in the Arctic and for the Arctic. Not all of these institutions are traditional international organizations, and many of them are not really Arctic specific. If you think of entities on the international level which make legally binding decisions, or at least political decisions with regard to the Arctic, you might first think of the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council brings together the 8 Arctic states, and we'll look at this in more detail later. Under the auspices of the Arctic Council, a number of international treaties have already been concluded, but it's more a forum for discussion, a forum also to exchange scientific information, and it now increasingly plays a role in governance, but still a very limited role. The value of the Arctic Council is whatever the member states and the permanent participants. In addition to the 8 member states, there are 6 organizations of indigenous peoples which are permanent participants. The value of the Arctic Council depends on what these actors make out of it. More narrowly, there are the Arctic 5, the 5 coastal states of the Arctic Ocean, which have come together occasionally, but they have not replaced the Arctic Council as the key forum for the international Arctic governance. On a regional level, we have a number of different efforts. For example, in our region, the Barents Zero Arctic region attempts a cross-border cooperation, also involving the Russian side of the border, or the Council for the Baltic Sea States. But then there are also institutions which make decisions which are relevant for the Arctic without being Arctic specific. A good example is the European Union. Sweden and Finland are members of the European Union. Norway and Iceland are in the European Economic Area. EU law matters for us. Between the Nordic countries, the borders had been open long before the EU came up with the Schengen system. But today, the Schengen Agreement is of crucial everyday importance for people living in our region. If you cross between Tornio and Haparanda, for example, you benefit from EU law because there's this open border. However, the Arctic is only one of many aspects that the EU has to deal with. And Sweden and Finland are only two of the many member states. So this is not an Arctic-specific forum or institution. We have NATO, which brings together a number of Nordic Arctic countries, and which is cooperating closely also with non-member states, raising the issue of how can we protect security in the region. Keep in mind that for a lot of tasks in remote and dangerous areas, this is similar in Antarctica as well as in the Arctic, states then rely on the military, often because it's a military which has the capacity to engage in specific activities in harsh environments. The Arctic Council, since its foundation, has always been clear that they're not going to discuss security issues. The Arctic has always been, or has long been at least, since the middle of the 20th century, an important area in terms of security issues. Think of the role that submarines played during the Cold War. It's now been announced recently by the Russian Federation that during its upcoming chairmanship of the Arctic Council, Russia is going to look at questions of national security as well. We still don't know how this is going to play out, which effects this is going to have. But security might become a more relevant issue in the Arctic in the future. At the core of the Arctic is the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic Ocean, or the Arctic, is an ocean surrounded by land. So it's really the opposite of Antarctica, where you have a landmass surrounded by the Southern Ocean. Here we have a central sea. Now, even with climate change, the Arctic Ocean is still far away from becoming a new Mediterranean. But if you look at the shape of the Arctic Ocean, you see that it has the potential to have a similar function. An ocean surrounded by states. This makes maritime issues of crucially important for the Arctic. The Law of the Sea Convention is an important legal instrument regulating the Arctic Ocean, but it also applies to other oceans around the world, on the seas around the world. In this context, the work of the International Maritime Organization and of the specialized entities created in the maritime sector is very important. These, however, are not Arctic specific. So here you have over 100 countries, almost 200 countries coming together and creating norms and regulations which are relevant for the Arctic. This is something where the question can be asked, how much do we how much influence do we in the Arctic, do Arctic states actually have there? The IMO, especially with regard to the technical aspects of ship operations, they rely heavily on practical expertise. Nevertheless, it can be said that the UN, the Convention on Law of the Seas, creates a form or a playing field in which the Arctic states only play a small role. This could be seen, for example, during the work leading to the creation of the Polar Code, which entered into force in the 1st of January of 2017. The Polar Code basically is meant to enhance safety for ships in the Arctic and in the Southern Ocean. And a lot of countries participate in creating these norms, in setting up these standards. The Arctic input was, of course, important and valuable, but was not international law for the Arctic made in the Arctic. Here, we can ask ourselves, is this actually necessary? Do we actually need law to be made in the Arctic for the Arctic? Well, elsewhere we have that too. We have, if you look at international human rights law, for example, we have regional human rights instruments, like the European Convention human rights. We have a regional human rights instrument for Africa, and for the Americas. So there are regionalization efforts. In other fields, we have global sets of norms, for example, in the law of the sea. In the Arctic, these issues come together. And the Arctic states have often been trailblazers when it comes to regulating issues which are relevant for the Arctic and for the people who live here. This includes especially international environmental law in issues such as access to environmental information or long-range air pollution. The Arctic has an important contribution to make to the development of international law as a whole, but the Arctic region is also governed by international law. It probably does not help that the Arctic Council, the key forum for international governance in the Arctic, is not really an international organization in the classical sense of the term. But it is a forum which has been fairly successful. So far there have been 3 binding international treaties come out of the Arctic Council. But it is dealing with issues which are relevant for the Arctic, for example, search and rescue operations. But most importantly, the Arctic Council is successful because it brings together states which have very different interests and also very different political systems. And that's a key aspect of governance in the Arctic, that this governance happens across political boundaries. That it's possible in the Arctic to cooperate with partners, even though there's significant disagreement about issues in other areas. Insofar, cooperation in the Arctic is somewhat similar to cooperation in outer space, where we have a significant effort to cooperate, for example, on the International Space Station, even though there are political divides, especially between the Russian Federation and Europe, or West. Diplomacy continues to play an important role here. Now, one thing that makes the Arctic Council so successful is that political decisions, policy decisions, they're actually based on science. The Arctic Council has its origins in working groups and collaborative efforts on a scientific basis. So here we have an example for how governance can work on the international level when decision makers actually listen to the scientists. We have a number of working groups in the Arctic Council, for example, on the Arctic Contaminants Action Program, the Monitoring and Assessment Program for the Arctic AMAP, a working group on conservation of flora and fauna, a working group on emergency prevention, preparedness and response, a working group called PAME, PAME, protection of the Arctic marine environment, and the Sustainable Development Working Group. And this already gives you an idea of what the Arctic Council is about. Protecting the environment, but for the people. Also protecting human safety with the emergency prevention, preparedness, and response efforts. The observer states have a possibility to contribute, though they're not full members. And the Arctic Council aims at working through different ways of projects. For example, environmental studies, assessments, and so on. Or also through reports. The reports which are created by the working groups of the Arctic Council, they're a great source of information. So when you do research on a specific topic in the Arctic, have a look at working groups of the Arctic Council, because a lot of information is already out there. There's a tremendous effort which is being made there, and it's a wonderful source of a lot of information. Another similar source might be the work of the Nordic Council of Ministers. They are also funding a lot of research and making it available online as well. The Arctic Council is not being replaced by other entities. I mentioned that the coastal states have been working a bit more closely together, for example, with regard to the CAOFA, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, but this does not replace the Arctic Council. It's important to keep in mind. The natural environment is often at the forefront of a lot of governance efforts in the Arctic, be it through the Arctic Council, the A5, the 5 coastal states, or the Barents Regional Council, or the Euro-Barents Cooperation. The environment is important in terms of Arctic governance because it's important to the people who live here. A lot of communities, especially indigenous communities, are closely related to nature insofar as our life depends on nature to a certain degree, to a significant degree. This might be easy to forget in the bigger cities. So a lot of the Arctic is, of course, urban as well. But we depend on an intact environment. And this is something that informs and inspires a lot of the work that's going on in the Arctic in terms of Arctic governance. Now, the environment is often threatened, for example, by attempts to make a living through non-traditional ways, such as mining, other forms of extractive industries, also tourism. And of course, simply living up north, we need infrastructure. The increasing need for infrastructure and for other sources of income mean that there are often clashes between different land uses. Environmental pollution is particularly dangerous for Arctic communities, especially in places where food security depends on a good and intact healthy environment. We've seen this earlier this year with splits in Russia on several occasions. The degradation of the natural environment forms a real threat to a lot of Arctic communities, in particular in the context of water pollution. What we have to aim at, and what a lot of Arctic communities try to achieve, is sustainable development, meaning economic progress without abandoning the wealth, the natural wealth of the region, without damaging the natural environment. Sustainability remains a major challenge for a lot of Arctic communities. Some of you might have participated in the Arctic Migration Conference recently. We also discussed the issue of outward migration from the Arctic. Like in other parts of the world, rural locations in the Arctic see a lot of outward migration. And the cities like Rovaniemi or Murmansk or Tromsø, they're growing. But things get more difficult in terms of population numbers, and then in second step, also in terms of infrastructure, in many places, in more rural areas. There's often, in many Arctic countries, a temptation to see the Arctic as an area from which to take resources, for example, through mining, oil drilling, and so on, for the people who live here. This is not just a resource, but it's their home. Sustainable development will make it possible to actually have a good life in material terms in the Arctic, but also in the sense of a healthy life, of living in a healthy environment. Sustainable development remains a core challenge for the Arctic and for a lot of Arctic communities. It's also an issue where a number of issues that I want to talk about in these lectures come together. Human safety, a safe human environment, but also security, access to education, access to healthy foods, but also corporate interests and also the rights of corporations, the need for meaningful work, things like that. We're going to look in live lectures, I hope we can have a bit of a discussion there, and the question, what kind of businesses do exist in the Arctic? They can range from traditional livelihoods, arts and crafts, reindeer herding, fishing, and so on, to high-tech jobs. It includes mining as well as tourism. And these jobs have different impacts on the people and on the environment. Now with the current pandemic, we already see the impact this has on the tourism sector. Natural resources are seen as an important economic factor in many parts of the Arctic. Yet this can conflict with other forms of work, especially with traditional livelihoods. And at the end of the day, we have to ask the question, who should actually make these decisions? Who gets to decide how the Arctic is used in economic terms? But there are also other stakeholders. We've mentioned the indigenous peoples, we've mentioned states and corporations. But of course, as scientists, we also have an interest in the Arctic. In the last years, there's fortunately been a stronger focus on the co-creation of knowledge about the Arctic together with the indigenous people who live in the Arctic, both in anthropology but also in natural sciences, for example. The idea is that the research done in the Arctic should aim at providing practical benefits for the people who live in the Arctic. And that's also part of my approach to international Arctic law, that this is not just something theoretical, but something which has to provide tangible benefits for the people living in the Arctic. For example, by enhancing the protection of human safety or of the natural environment. We can see that we have a number of actors in the Arctic with complex interactions, very diverse at times interests, often competing interests. And there's a fundamental need to share knowledge and to gain knowledge. But not as an end in itself, but for purpose. For the purpose of building something better together. And this ends of first video in this series. I'll continue in the next days, putting up a few more videos basically, as I mentioned earlier, as a backup in case you should have technical difficulties during the upcoming lectures on the 17th, 18th, and 19th of November. As always, feel free to drop me an email if there should be any questions, and get in touch.